Tua, Tyreek, and Waddle are all locked in for the Miami Dolphins. What does it mean now and into the future for Miami? We're exploring all of those dynamics today on the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast.
You are Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes, your daily podcast for NFL and college football scouting. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's better than this? It's guys being dudes here on the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast. We're the Draft Dudes. I'm Joe Marino from Locked On Bills. He's Kyle Krabs from Locked On Dolphins. And we are your NFL experts here with you daily to talk team building across the league on the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with the Draft Dudes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Want to issue a big thank you, shout out, and welcome to our everydayers. Those of you who never miss a single episode, we appreciate y'all being here very, very much. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started.
Joe, good to be back with you. Welcome home.
Thank you, and welcome home to you. The drive was wonderful. Lots of great music. I know that your trip back home was a little dicey, but hey, we're both home.
My pro tip for anyone who flies in and out of South Florida: when you're flying home, get the travel insurance. No. And book 2 flights on 2 separate airlines.
Just go ahead and cancel one of them. There you go.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because I think this is like 3 straight times I've tried to fly home from South Florida and something's happened with my plane. Either you didn't have a pilot or a crew, or there's a bird strike and they had to find me a new plane, or they just texted me like they did this time and said, hey, your flight's canceled tomorrow.
All the best.
With a tropical storm in the Gulf, just waiting for it to bank a hard right and get me pinned down for 3 days. So yeah, it was eventful getting home, but we got it taken care of. So it's good to be back.
Well, speaking of South Florida, our topic today is the team that plays their home games in South Florida. It's the Miami Dolphins. And, you know, the reason this podcast took the direction that it did is for conversations like the one that we're going to have. Fascinating team building conversations to be had about the Miami Dolphins and some of their recent decisions. And so my idea, actually, I wanted to do this. So for anybody that's thinking, well, Kyle just want to talk about the Dolphins all day, that's not true. This was 100% my idea. And I actually pretty much planned the entire conversation. So you could direct any thoughts that you have to me on that. But I'm fascinated to pick Kyle's brain here about this Dolphins team and the decisions that they've made recently to hand out contracts to Tua and Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, and what this means now and into the future as the Dolphins are set out to enter year 3 of Mike McDaniel and with a really good roster around them, right? I think, you know, we measured the Dolphins up this summer with our process, and they came in scoring pretty well, and they were well represented on the NFL 100 with a high volume of players. And so I'm excited to dive into this football team with you today here, Kyle Krabs.
Yeah, obviously this was spurred on by when I was in training camp. Tua got his much speculated on contract extension, and then Tyreek Hill really gets a contract adjustment more than he did. Very little new money. It was just kind of reallocation of money that existed. And we'll get into those when we get into contracts. But this offseason for Miami had a lot of people coming in having a lot of different thoughts about what the outlook of the team was. I mean, there was beat reporters locally in Miami who Christian Wilkins, Andrew Van Ginkel, and Robert Hunt signed elsewhere for a combined $230 million. And they said that this window is closed. The rebuild was all for naught. They spent the last 5 years. They didn't win a playoff game. They lost all their core talent. They don't have a plan. They started out drafting everybody, and then they started trading for everybody, and now they're not re-signing anybody. And I think this picture is a lot clearer now some 4 or 5 months later to kind of look at, okay, we didn't make decisions to invest in Christian Wilkins and Robert Hunt in lieu of who you've kind of identified as the centerpieces of what your identity is offensively. And for an offensive-minded coach, that makes a ton of sense. There's been a lot of new blood infused into the defensive side of the ball with a new scheme. But the big money right now sits in the three guys that we're talking about. A young quarterback who the team is banking on still has levels of his game that he can continue to tap into as far as being a more efficient player. Tyreek Hill in the prime of his career, and Jaylen Waddle, who I'll be honest, I think has had a better training camp than Tyreek Hill. And I think Tyreek Hill, if he were not here, Jaylen Waddle would probably assume a role similar to what Tyreek Hill is and be very close to the same stature as player, but he doesn't have to be. So for the time being, he's the 1B.
I think it's fair to say, and you kind of alluded to it, that the Dolphins made choices, and you don't always know what the end result is at the time, but now we're getting that picture much more clear. And I don't think you could do everything, right? It wasn't a matter of you couldn't pay Wilkins, Hunt, and these three players, and so they made a choice. And it's probably the right choice given you think about the Miami Dolphins, it's Tua, it's Tyreek Hill, it's Jaylen Waddle. That's the identity of this Miami Dolphins football team. How do you reconcile that? I mean, I think that it's the right choice to lean into these players, right? You can find another defensive tackle, you can find another guard, but you're not going to be able to replicate the elements that exist with Tua, Jaylen Waddle, and Tyreek Hill with pretty much anyone else. This feels like the right path forward for this iteration of the Dolphins.
Yeah, and I was hoping I was going to get a chance to ask Mike McDaniel this when I was in South Florida, and I didn't. But what Miami has with skill players is one of the unique counters that exists to the trend across the league. I don't know if you caught Sean McVay. He went on with Robert Mays with the Athletic Football Show, their podcast, and did an interview. And Sean McVay said, Robert Mays asked him about kind of when you were first with the Rams, everybody was living in that Legion of Boom cover 3 type of world, and you could run all these cover 3 beaters because everybody kind of had the same template of this is how you play defense structurally in the league, right? Mm-hmm. And as that has changed and shifted, you've had to evolve. And one of the things that Sean McVay said is you need all 5 eligibles out there to space the field against what these defenses are now trying to do to you.
Yep.
And you consider about Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, and then the speed of the backfield, and now potentially speed at tight end with Jonnu Smith and Odell Beckham is the third wide receiver when they go 11 personnel. They have a unique ability because of these players to space the field and attack coverages while maintaining potentially 6-man protections or sometimes 7-man protections, because if you compound the speed and play those players off of each other, it forces more space and helps you create more leverage to run routes that other teams might not be able to achieve with 4 eligibles because of how dynamic those players are. And that's one of the unique flavors of what Miami has going for them and why these players complement each other so well. And they kind of have this force multiplier where one player is really good, but then you stack another player with his strengths over top of it and it becomes more dynamic. And then you have a quarterback who sees the game like Tua does and it becomes more dynamic. And then you have a play caller, Mike, and how he calls the game and it becomes more dynamic. So that's the stacking of the primary traits of players that allows this to work the way that it has so far.
Yeah, I listened to Sean McVay. I don't know if it was on that particular podcast, but I listened to him recently talking about eligibles, and he put it in a way that I never really thought about it, and it really hit home for me. He said 20%. Like if you keep someone in the block, you're losing 20% of your eligibles on a play, right? You only get 5. Yeah. And so I thought that was an interesting way to, if you think about it, 20%, 40%, right? We're not math guys, but it adds up, and you only get so many guys that you can use as eligibles. If I were a fan of the Miami Dolphins, I would be excited that Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle are locked in long term. We're going to get into the specifics of those deals in the next segment. I'd be excited about those two guys existing with Tua Tagovailoa. But to me, what really puts this team over the top this year in my mind is the ancillary pieces that exist outside of those guys. Those guys are a problem, right? Like that's a problem for any defense to deal with. But when you add a Jonnu Smith at tight end, which is far more dynamic than anything Durham Smythe has provided this team, when you add even more depth at running back with a Jalen Wright, and knowing that you've had some injuries with Mostert and Achane last year, you have a deeper hedge there with a guy like Jalen Wright.
Wright's going to run the ball downhill too.
Yeah, he's going to dynasty owner Joe Marino, big Jalen Wright guy here.
That's a different dynamic than like Raheem Mostert has a very high yards after contact, but like the vast, like 80-something% of his yards after contact came on wide zone plays. And then Devon Achane's not a big guy. Well, Jalen Wright's used to running more inside zone against light boxes at Tennessee. And that's another added layer to that running game too that you're talking about, where now you don't just have to rely on running outside zone either.
Right. In addition to, you mentioned Odell. Like, I don't know if Odell's going to work out. I don't know if Eric Ezukanma is going to work out. I don't know if Malik Washington's going to work out.
Ezukanma's not going to happen, I'll tell you that.
But listen, something in there is probably going to hit, right? And I think that provides more dynamic ability as the third wide receiver than we saw from them last year, knowing that they do have Craycraft and Berrios. But then over the top of all of this is that this is, everybody understands this is a timing-based rhythm offense. And now you're in year 3 together. And that only creates a deeper menu of options and time on task together and inventory, right? That as you have had the success that Miami has had over the last couple of years offensively, all of these guys in place, not only this year, but into the future with more layers, sets the stage for a very dynamic football team when it comes to the Miami Dolphins offense. So I think the current outlook looks really, really good. Maybe where people have questions is the future outlook. And so coming up next, Kyle and I are going to explore the reality of the deals for Hill, Waddle, and Tua. And then later on, we're going to get into the future dynamics that are going to exist with the salary cap and other decisions Miami has to make. Folks, be sure to stick with us. I love sports. I love them so much and never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. And maybe you want to get in on some Miami Dolphins props. Well, got some things that stood out to me. You can get Tua at plus 360 to top 4,500 passing yards this year. How about Tyreek Hill? You can get him at plus 600 to lead the league in receiving. And I really like this one. Jaylen Waddle over. If the over hits on 5.5 receiving touchdowns, you can get that at plus 108. So check that out and more over at FanDuel and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
So which one of these contracts do you want to touch on first?
Let's start with the one that just happened, and that's the Tyreek Hill deal. And this is interesting because there's no additional years added to this, right? And I'll let you explain this because I know that you've obviously spent more time researching this than me, but they've certainly put Tyreek Hill, they've moved some money forward and compensate him pretty handsomely moving forward. So I'm sure there's a lot of comfort in knowing that who I think is the most, I mean,
NFL players voted them number one.
Number one. But what was the phrase I went to? Like the most scary offensive player to go against, whatever he is. He's in Miami for the foreseeable future, locked in, guaranteed money. Break down this deal for us.
Yeah, so he was owed about 3 years, $86 million in cash. He had signed a 4-year, $120 million contract extension. Dolphins traded for him in a contract year from Kansas City. So he had 5 years of player control. The first 2 years had come and gone, so he has 3 years of contract left on his deal. That has stayed the same, but the way that they got to the $30 million APY on his 4-year, $120 million extension was he was due like $45 million in cash, non-guaranteed cash in 2026. So it's kind of like what happened with Patrick Mahomes' contract last offseason, where it was like, hey, we got these really fat years at the back end of it that's not guaranteed, that something's going to be done with this contract before then anyway. It was just the year that the wait for those years for Tyreek was shorter than what Mahomes's was, where his was 5, 6, 7 years from now. Tyreek's was 3 years from now. It was the dummy year that blew up the average of the deal. He had this year's base salary, which was just under $20 million in cash, as the last remaining guaranteed money on the contract. So when they redid the deal, the final 3 years, they gave him a signing bonus and a roster bonus for this year. That gave him about a $5-6 million raise in cash. And then in 2025, he got an option bonus, which can be prorated out like a signing bonus would. And they put a couple void years on the back end of the deal to allow that to happen. So they diminished the salary cap hit. They end up moving about $13-14 million from that 45 in the last year in 2026. They moved that money up into 2024 and 2025. So he gets a raise to keep his dollars competitive. He gets $65 million guaranteed between this year and next year. And then the last year has no guaranteed money in it, which was what it was before. But instead of having $19 million in guaranteed money this year, and that's it, he now has $65 million guaranteed over the next 2 years.
Here's the question that I have, and I mean this in like, I'm not making light of this. Is the win for Miami with this deal that they avoid any complications with a player like Tyreek Hill?
Yes.
Right, because it's hard to, like, if you just look at it from, okay, they just gave him more guaranteed money, but the win is that you lock in a player like Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
With no
Tyreek's excited because over the next 2 years, he can look at his pay and say it's an AAV of 32.5. And to Tyreek's credit, he said when it was first reported that he was looking for a new deal, I don't need to be the highest paid wide receiver. I just want a competitive contract relative to my peers.
Which is what he got.
He could have held their feet to the fire and said, pay me $71 million guaranteed over the next 2 years so I get more than Justin Jefferson and whatever. And he would have had a very good argument for that to be the case. And he didn't. And he said, it's more important for me to stay in Miami for an extended period. But yeah, when you consider Tyreek every offseason and sometimes in season has those things that happen off the field or away from the field, that it's not what you want one of your star players to be in the headlines for one reason or another. So for Miami to say, okay, we're on the doorstep of this year, you're going to get a 90-man, $17 million roster bonus that we're going to pay you, and then a signing bonus, and that all gets prorated out. Your salary for 2025 is guaranteed, and then 2026 with no new years on the back end of it. We soften the salary cap hits by using void years to kind of space the dead money. So now we're potentially looking at a little bit more dead money in 2026 if we were to move on from you after 2026, but for sure. And this is, you never want, and the Dolphins did this with Xavier Howard. And I know other teams have done this with other players with multiple years left on deals, doing new deals altogether and putting more years on the back of it. And then it doesn't work out with that player at some point. And it's like, you're in year one of
familiar with this. Yes.
You're in year one of the new deal and the player doesn't play for your team anymore.
Oh, wow. I saw this.
Yeah.
I saw this movie. I don't like this movie.
And that's why I mentioned Xavier Howard first, because Miami did it too, right? So it's like, don't do that with, you have no incentive to do that with 3 years of player control left. So that's the win for Miami, like you said.
Jalen, let's get the other receiver out and then we'll talk to it. Jaylen Waddle. This deal already looks like a bargain, right? Like,
correct.
I mean, they kind of felt it at the time, but for him, he's entering his age 25 season. He signed it. What was it? A 3-year, $84.75 million extension. Mm-hmm. This is one heck of a deal for Miami. Seems like there's a lot of good flexibility baked in. I'll let you break it down.
It's really 5 years of player control because he had his 4th year of his rookie contract and his 5th year option, and then 3 years on top of it. And this kind of tells you everything you need to know about how Miami planned and structured this. Jaylen Waddle's salary cap hits for the next 3 years in 2024, 2025, and 2026. $9 million, $8 million, and 11.6.
Mm-hmm.
Those also happen to coincide with the years that Tyreek Hill is under contract with the team.
Right.
And then in 2027, the salary cap hit becomes 33.8.
Yeah.
Which is about what Tyreek Hill's salary cap hit was this year before he got the new restructured contract with the void years on the back end. Yeah. So they have a very clear succession plan there for what that's going to look like. And that's a lot of this strategy from a team building perspective with Miami. And we'll get into it with the Tua contract because there's a lot of good in that as far as examples from a team building strategy. But Miami they build a lot of exit ramps off of their contracts. And the way that they initially structure them when the player signs them is it gives the team a ton of annual flexibility to make strategic decisions because they have an owner with liquidity that doesn't mind writing those restructure checks on an annual basis.
Yeah, it's always fun to say things like, well, the Miami Dolphins have over $100 million passing game and their top two receivers and their quarterback, but that's not really true because the way that you structure the deals, the cap hits are offsetting. You could see the plan here. All right, want to make sure we don't get in trouble with Ross Jackson. Let's save the conversation about Tua and the future outlook for Miami and their team building decisions on the other side of it. Folks, be sure to stick with us. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's still hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. If you're thinking of starting therapy, be sure to give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. And of course, therapy is helpful. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for people who have experienced major trauma. All you got to do is head on over to BetterHelp.com/lockedon. You can fill out a brief questionnaire that'll get you matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
It's not a Tua deal.
Tua deal.
Everybody has a lot of opinions on.
Well, we're talking about the structure of the contract. That's what I'm interested in getting into. 4 years, $212 million. I know there's a bigger story to tell than that.
Yeah. So the way that they structured this contract, he gets his signing bonus, which was $42 million signing bonus. And then in 2025, he has a $25 million fully guaranteed salary, and then an additional $25 million option bonus or roster bonus, and that gets prorated out across 5 seasons. This is the best example of why they write these contracts this way, because you have 1/5 of a $42 million signing bonus, and okay, that's $8 million and change. And then 1/5 of a $25 million roster bonus, and that's another $5 million. So now you're at $13 million. And then you have a $25 million fully guaranteed base salary. The reason the Dolphins did this, it kind of got the sense Tua wanted to be able to have some lump sum take-home cash, because that's the popular thing with all of the new quarterback contracts, right? Is you get the option bonuses automatically baked into the contract. It gets prorated out like a signing bonus. The player receives one check for the lump sum, and he gets the cash up front at the beginning of the calendar year, right? Like that's the big-time strategy. It's how the Eagles did it with Jalen Hurts, and they just kind of had this rolling guarantee where 18 months in advance, your next year's or that upcoming year became fully guaranteed. So there was some of that with half of his scheduled salary. They left the other half. And I go back to what the Dolphins did this year with Bradley Chubb's contract, where they restructured to create salary cap space, but they didn't do a max restructure. They left $6 million of base salary with Bradley Chubb's to knock down his cap hit They wrote him a check, but they left $6 million in base salary, which is the salary that he receives on a weekly basis for the remainder of the season by check. They kind of budget, and you get the sense once they have an idea on how much budget they need, that's when they do the restructure and create the space. But they don't automatically do the max restructures up front to keep the cap hits as low as possible, because they want to know, hey, what's our budget this year? What other things did we do? Do we need to create all this space? Can we afford to keep some as base salary and not defer automatically as much as possible without having the creative liberty to decide on how much we pass along? So that's kind of what stands out to me about the year two, is they could have very easily said, hey, you're due $50 million in cash. We're going to do $48 million of it as a bonus that we'll write the check for up front, no questions asked. But then what happens if you don't need all that space? Now you're deferring more against your future years for no reason. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole debate about future cap space versus current year cap space and the value of that. But they just want to have the flexibility to make the creative decision of how to do that with all of their players. And that's why when they're signing their contracts, they are leaving big base salaries, because you look at his year two cap hit, it's $40 million. I promise you it's not going to be $40 million. It's just, do we want it to be $18 million? Do we want it to be $23 million? Do we want it to be $26 million? Like, they'll make that decision when they get an idea on how they want to budget and then what they're doing like post June 1st for other guys that they potentially move on from for the next wave of free agency.
I think one of the interesting things about all of this that's went down for the Miami Dolphins, whether it's the players they didn't retain, the players they brought in, the players they extended, is we sit here today on August 5th, August 6th, whenever you're listening to this podcast, and the Miami Dolphins have a lot of cap space right now. They have $35 million in cap space right now, and I think the Tua deal really helped with that, right? It brought down his cap hit, I think,
so
pretty simple.
Tua created $14 million in cap space, and then the Tyreek Hill restructure created another 13.
So they have a lot of cap space right now, and that's helpful, right? That certainly positions them to be able to add on players or make a trade at the deadline to absorb some salary. That's a good spot to be. But I think what maybe a lot of people are wondering about is the future outlook for Miami and what that looks like. And I know that there's a lot of different resources out there that give you cap projections. And so the Dolphins are going to be over the cap going into next year, but this is where I would like you to kind of comment on, okay, we know there's always levers, there's always money in the banana stand.
Yeah.
How flexible, like what type of shape is Miami in when it comes to 2025, 2026?
So if you omit Teron Armstead, the Dolphins have about $80 million in basic restructure accessibility. They also have whatever they don't use from this year's salary cap, they can roll over into the following year. So you need about $4 million for your practice squad, $4 or $5 million for your practice squad throughout the season, whatever their operating budget is. Assume they bring a player in or something like that. Like, what do you want to aggressively say they take $15 million in cap space so they can potentially tap into $20 million in rollover cap? The Tua contract by itself, he's got $25 million that you could create another $18 million in cap space or so just by restructuring that one. The only contract that they've done recently where they proactively said, we're going to automatically give you a minimum salary with a check up front for the rest of your compensation is the Waddle contract. I mean, even Tyreek Hill, they just did that one. And I believe he has a $10 million salary next year that's fully guaranteed. So it's just a question of how much do you want to redivvy that up? But they could restructure that too.
Yeah.
So you're looking at probably about $100 million or so in flexibility without void years to go up. And then Teron Armstead is a player who kind of flirted with retirement. I have an expectation after they just spent a second-round pick on Patrick Paul, that succession plan is in place, and that's part of this long-term building strategy, right? They can save $14 million post June 1st if they move on from Teron Armstead, or if Teron Armstead retires, he could restructure his deal and they could tap into that money right off the jump, which is who was it? Corey Linsley did that, I think, if I remember correctly. Somebody restructured and deferred their salary into like a lump sum post, like in August or something like that, so that it didn't count against the cap, and then they retired and forfeited the salary because they were intending on retiring. So like sometimes players do that, and Teron Armstead was very flexible with it all. Like he took a pay cut this year to stay on the team.
Yeah. So I absolutely recognize the flexibility that Miami has, and nobody should really have sticker shock when it comes to, okay, whatever you think it is, 40 million over, 50 million, 60 million over. There's just different ways to calculate it. Everyone projects a different cap. The Dolphins will be over. You mentioned that they have a lot of levers that they can pull. It feels like there's a little bit of some complications with those levers. Like you obviously don't want to pull them all. And it feels like some of the most meaningful levers to be pulled. This year is going to give you the information that you need, but like, do you want to lock yourself in longer to a Chubb or a Ramsey, or like, are you ready to do things with Tua's deal at that point, right? Like, am I right in looking at some of this and thinking, yeah, I see the flexibility, but some of those biggest tickets are a little bit questionable if I want to do it. But they do have a lot of options.
Yeah, I wouldn't be too concerned about the Tua deal in particular, just because they will still have a lot of flexibility on the back 2 years of that deal based on how the guarantees set up. And that's one of the larger cap hits scheduled for the team. Now, I think you think about Bradley Chubb, and that's totally a fair one to invoke, but that position group in general has two rookies in Chop Robinson, right, and Mohamed Kamara that you have high expectations for, plus Jaelen Phillips is kind of the heir and successor to Bradley Chubb, and then you have Chop Robinson as the other guy they hope is going to be on a long-term contract. So I think you could potentially, instead of restructuring Bradley Chubb, I also wouldn't be surprised if he was another designated post-June 1st departure from the team if Chop Robinson plays at a high level this year. And then that's kind of your segue. You say, okay, we'll extend Jaelen Phillips so you can cut his cap hit in about half. And then his next big cap hit probably won't come until 2027, 2028. Right. So like the early years of that deal, you really don't feel the big years unless you choose to. Mm-hmm. You don't really feel the big years until year 3 of the new contract.
I think part of the comfort Miami should have is in that it feels like a lot of what they have is signed, right? Like I'm looking at future contracts, particularly next offseason. The big one, of course, is Jevon Holland. We could talk about that. I think the other big one, probably David Long, but then it's like fill in the blanks guys. Now there's good depth players. There's even some starters, but I call them more fill in the blanks where you could probably target free agents and feel good about your ability to replace if necessary, or just bring those players back on modest deals. But what's your pulse check now on their ability to retain Holland? And then can they bring on, do you think there's some big ticket opportunities that exist in the future? Or is this going to be more, hey, we really kind of need to draft to replenish this roster?
So I think you've seen cyclically it's been a little bit of both, where it was very draft heavy and focused to start. Yeah. And then it became very aggressive free agency and trade heavy in 2022 with Chubb at the deadline and Tyreek and signing Teron Armstead. And they went through kind of that lull with the draft picks. They're scheduled to get a 3 for Christian Wilkins back. They took liberties with trading a future 3 for the 4th round pick to draft Jalen Wright. So and then they have a Robert Hunt comp pick that will clock in somewhere as well. So I do think you're going to start to see a little bit more draft by volume, but they were very not drafting for need focused with the Patrick Paul pick. I mean, everybody associated them as having this need on the interior offensive line, and your top 3 tackles were Armstead, Kendall Lamb, who was good in his absence last year, and Austin Jackson, who they gave a contract extension to in season last year. So I think if they have opportunities with premium positions, I would still expect they're going to take their primary spots and invest them in premium positions. So that kind of casts a little bit of a shadow on Jevon Holland. Do you pay Jevon Holland? They typically have not paid or invested heavily in traditionally non-premium positions. I mean, just think about Chris Grier from a draft history and perspective. 2019 was Christian Wilkins, defensive tackle. It's become a premium position, right? And then in 2020, it was quarterback, offensive tackle, cornerback. In 2022, it was wide receiver and edge. Or in 2021, wide receiver and edge. Then in 2022, they traded their first round pick for a wide receiver. And then they traded their 2023 first round pick for another edge. And then they used their 2024 first round pick on another edge. So like they have been premium asset based, very, very focused on those traditionally premium positions and high athleticism players at those spots. So that's the big question now is the Christian Wilkins departure and the Robert Hunt departure at guard, is that an indication of Jevon Holland where we have our price for you, and if you're not going to take it, then go get your money elsewhere? Or are they going to kind of value that you're a homegrown talent, we want you to play through the prime of your career here? I think that's the biggest question kind of with the future outlook, because they have the opportunity to tap into that now if they want to, and even kind of front load that a little bit with all this cap space that they now have if they were to get Jevon Holland on a contract extension.
Well, and I think Jevon Holland's an outstanding football player and certainly a player that is going to demand a lot of money and should. But you also look at the safety position.
Right.
And right now, I mean, what did Condre Diggs just sign for?
1 year for up to 5.
Right. Come on, man. Justin Simmons is available right now.
Yeah.
I mean, you saw Marcus May, the Dolphins added him in June, right? Like Eddie Jackson was signed in July. It's okay, right? Like if there's anything,
there's other guys still out there too that you didn't even mention.
Right. So like it's not anything to panic over, but you certainly wouldn't want to replace your whole safety room, because I think it would be Holland, Poyer, May are all 1 year deals. So
right.
But if there's a position where you're going to kind of, I don't know what we're going to do, it's probably safety, because the veterans just stick around and
that's interesting, because they moved on from a highly paid player in Jerome Baker and chose to pay a younger player in Jordyn Brooks. And one of the questions that I asked at training camp, and he was a little dismissive of it, but I asked Joe Barry about too high shells. And does that stress trickle down to your linebackers? Is that a more important kind of element and stress point of your defense? And he said, I don't necessarily think so, because you still shift to all of these different schemes and coverages, even if you're presenting in too high. But at the same time, the athleticism and the range that it takes to execute that, it requires a lot. And some of these teams are more than content to just play and sit in too high and limit explosive plays. And you've got half the field. And as long as you sit over top of stuff and you have good vision, you're fine. And like, that's not that hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this will be a big year for Jevon Holland, assuming that they don't get that contract done ahead of the season. Right. To be able to move around and kind of showcase the value that would be required for a contract like that.
Feels like with that $35 million, you could maybe front load quite a bit of that and take care of them. But obviously there's a lot that goes into those types of decisions as well, and maybe needing some rollover cap space to help you with next year. So there's the Dolphins. Yeah.
There's the Dolphins. Very interesting team, because they aren't invested super high in the offensive line, right? And that's kind of the question a lot of Dolphins fans have. And we know
share the Chris Forrester quote. Share the Chris Forrester quote, right?
Like draft and pay guys that score touchdowns. We'll figure it out up front. because it's all based off angles and spacing. And we talked about the spacing that the Dolphins skill players can create.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there a glass ceiling over that? We'll see if San Francisco can break through it or if Miami or one of these other teams can break through it. But that's for another day. That's going to do it for us here on Locked On NFL Scouting. I'm Kyle Krabs. He is Joe Marino. We appreciate you guys, as always, for checking out the show. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Make it a great rest of your day. We are out of here.